Under the harsh summer sun of Santa Vita, where dry winds carried the scent of dust and old gasoline, a man stood silently beside the showroom display, his eyes hidden behind worn-out sunglasses, as if he were listening to the air rather than the people. Barely 5 steps away, a slick-haired salesman with gold chains glinting against his chest cracked a half smile and dropped a line that seemed to suck the air out of the space. Old man Rowe's gone. His kid's running the place now, and all he cares about is money, not legacy. The words landed like a clean slice through memory, stripping away not just a name, but an entire history written in motor oil and trust. The man in the weathered leather jacket and dust-covered boots wasn't just another walk-in. He was Ethan Rowe, 42, CEO of Rowe Ride Motorsports, and the only son of Robert Rowe, the legendary founder whose name had just been trampled before his very eyes. Ethan hadn't returned dressed in tailored suits or driving a high-end car. He came in the form of a seasoned biker, someone people could easily overlook. He hadn't planned to interfere. The reason for his visit was simple: to quietly observe, to understand what had cracked open within the store that was once the beating heart of the local biker community. But with just one careless sentence from the young salesman, Kyle Mercer, something stirred within him. It wasn't anger. It was awakening. Not a personal offense, but a violation of every value his father had built: kindness, integrity, and the belief that the open road belonged to anyone who loved engines and the miles ahead. Ethan's hand tightened in his pocket, fingernails digging into his palm as if to ground himself in the role he had chosen to play. He couldn't give himself away. Not yet. Before making any decisions, he needed to see the whole truth, the depth of the decay within the service culture here, and the lives entangled in it. But in that moment, standing amid the gleam of showroom-polished bikes, inside a dealership that now resembled a luxury boutique more than the garage once known as a space open to all, Ethan realized this was no longer the Rowe Ride he remembered, no longer the place where he once sat beside his father for hours, learning to tune an engine until it sang to the soul. The young salesman kept going, oblivious to the sacred ground he'd just desecrated. He smirked as he spoke about profit margins, marketing campaigns, and customers who dream big but can't afford the ride. Ethan didn't respond, nor did he walk away. He stood still, letting Kyle's words seep into a space that had once been a sanctuary for those who craved freedom. And in that silence, a declaration began to take form within him. It wasn't about retaliation. It was about beginning again. The glass doors slid open softly as Ethan stepped inside. The scent of fresh motor oil mixed with synthetic cologne from hidden diffusers behind the counters rushed at him, a smell both familiar and strangely hollow. For years, managing the company from headquarters in Denver, he had received glowing reports about the Santa Vita branch's strong sales, steady customer return, consistent growth. But behind the numbers were fragmented stories from longtime clients, whispers of cold service, and a new team that only spoke in warranty packages and add-on fees. And it was those whispers that had brought him back not as a CEO wielding authority, but as a son searching for the pulse of a legacy nearly lost to commercial polish. Inside the showroom, white LED lights cast an even glow, making each motorcycle look more like an exhibit than a machine meant to be ridden. Every bike was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the ceiling above, yet not a speck of road dust or a trace of a real journey clung to them. Beside a giant screen looping digital ads of racers in VR goggles, a leather glove display stood, packaged like boutique accessories. Ethan thought to himself, Dad wouldn't recognize this place anymore. He stopped in front of an old V-Star 1100, matte black, with upgraded non-slip handlebars and a saddle sunken just right, as if molded by a rider who'd spent 1,000 miles in the same seat. It didn't sparkle, but it had soul. It didn't speak in words, but you could almost hear the sharp turns, the long rain-swept rides, the stop in the desert to fix a brake line with a zip tie. But what caught Ethan's attention wasn't the bike itself, it was the absence of a price tag. Online, he remembered clearly, $3,800, Here there wasn't a single number in sight. Soon, a slick voice echoed behind him. "Looking for something to ride, my friend?" Ethan turned to face Kyle, a picture-perfect salesman who looked like he had just stepped out of a luxury motorcycle cologne campaign. "Just browsing," Ethan replied, keeping his voice low and detached. "Been a while since I touched a front wheel." Kyle laughed loudly, offering a handshake like they were old friends. "Kyle, the guy who turns four wheels into a thing of the past. Let me show you what freedom really looks like, row ride style." Ethan let himself be led, didn't resist, only listened as Kyle launched into a polished pitch about a $2,200 comprehensive care package, the very sort of upsell his father had once scoffed at as a tax on the clueless. Every line sounded rehearsed, every nod paired with a smug, confident smile. Ethan knew full well, at Row Ride, service add-ons had always been optional, but Kyle made them sound essential, like selling trust in something that might not even be needed. He looked around. Everything gleamed, but nothing felt warm. The staff behind the counter seemed to be performing roles, no one truly engaging with the engines, no one truly seeing the customers. And Ethan, the man who had spent his youth learning to diagnose bikes by the sound of their engines, now stood in what his father once called the headquarters of kindness, unable to hear anything but the noise of salesmanship. There was still much more he needed to see, but in his chest, a quiet question had already formed. Was there anything left, any sign that his father still lingered somewhere beneath the gloss and sheen, or had it all been buried under this corporate costume called efficiency? Under the showroom lights that shimmered off every polished coat of paint, Ethan walked slowly behind Kyle past a row of brand new bikes bearing aggressively marketed names: Falcon X, Steel Viper, Night Mirage models designed more to catch eyes than to stir a rider's urge to hit the road. With each step and every over-rehearsed line from Kyle, the distance between past and present deepened. When they stopped in front of a freshly released Viper 1300, Kyle lowered his voice as if granting an exclusive privilege. "Rolled out just last month. A tech influencer filmed here all morning. You should have seen the likes that video pulled in." Ethan gave a faint, expressionless nod. To him, the presence of an online influencer paled in comparison to the feel of gripping the throttle while cresting the ridges of four corners beneath the amber glow of dusk. But Kyle kept talking, sprinkling in phrases like seamless experience, app integration, 3-month free coverage, before leaning in as though sharing a secret. "If you finance through us, we'll throw in mobile ride tracking, stay in rhythm with tech, you know?" Ethan squinted, not from the lights, but from the clarity of what was being revealed. The values that once needed no explanation, honesty, mechanical knowledge, empathy for the rider, had been replaced with memorized scripts, persuasive yet hollow. Just a few feet ahead, he caught a scene his father had taught him to always notice: a father and his son, maybe 13, standing in front of a red cruiser like they were face to face with an unreachable dream. The boy's hands fidgeted inside his hoodie pocket, eyes glowing, while the father glanced down at the price tag, his face tightening. Ethan saw the hesitation in the man's expression, the silent math of trying to keep a promise and still afford the bus ride home. Before the father could look away, another salesman appeared as if summoned, smile preloaded, voice friendly just enough, steps light but calculated. Ethan didn't need to hear the pitch. He had seen this move 100 times. It wasn't customer care, it was a scent-driven ambush. From his spot, Ethan watched the man instinctively step back, shielding his wallet with his arm. It wasn't a choice anymore, just a reflex. Ethan stepped away from Kyle, pretending to be drawn to the used bike section at the far end of the showroom. This part of the floor seemed oddly out of place among the sterile modernity. The lighting was softer, handlebars dusty, signs faded, and the bikes no longer showroom perfect. Some seats were worn, mirrors scratched, throttles replaced with mismatched parts. But for that reason alone, they had soul. Here he saw the past. These bikes looked like they had seen rain, saved riders on long nights, or broken down quietly along nameless highways. One particular matte black Yamaha V-Star 1100 caught his eye, a small chip in the tank's paint, a clutch handle swapped out for a cheap but reliable anti-slip version. Ethan didn't need to check under the seat to know this had belonged to someone who understood machines but didn't have much to spare. He bent to check the price tag again. There was none. Kyle reappeared almost instantly, like he couldn't let a customer linger alone. "That one," he said, "just went up last week. Big demand. Vintage bikes are hot now. Probably 6.8, maybe 7 grand. Ethan looked up, his eyes cold. "It's listed online at 38. Kyle shrugged, his smile unshaken. "Old data. Algorithm hasn't updated the new markup. Everything's going up now. Supply chain, inflation, you get it." Then came the wink, the kind you see from people selling things they don't believe in. Like the two of them were somehow in on the same hustle, and the hustle itself was normal. Ethan said nothing, but this time, he let the silence stretch. He watched Kyle fidget, eyes flicking for an escape hatch in the conversation. Then, as a new couple entered through the front door, it felt like another layer of the room collapsed. Ethan rolled his sleeve back slowly. There was something deeper than revenue and branding fracturing here, and he was beginning to smell it more clearly with each passing minute. The door opened again, and this time, Ethan didn't need to turn around to know he had to pay attention. There was a subtle shift in the rhythm of the footsteps, something no sales pitch could mimic. The scuff of worn soles against tile, the heavy breathing of men who hadn't come for a brand experience but simply hoped for a machine that could get them to work and home again. Two men walked in, one in an old military jacket, shoulders slightly hunched, every step marked by weariness, and the other broader, sleeves frayed down to the thread, grease still clinging to his nails, eyes sunken from sleepless nights or worry that refused to let go. Ethan saw Kyle immediately break from his side, adjusting his collar like a reflex, a survival instinct when non-profitable customers appeared. Kyle headed toward them, his smile snapping back on like a mask reattached in a single breath. Ethan quietly stepped away, slipping behind a row of bikes, observing from just far enough to hear voices without drawing attention. The V-Star 1100 became the center of gravity again. The taller man, who Ethan would later learn was named Luis, bent low, his eyes fixed on the body of the bike, tilting his head slightly as if listening to sounds only he could hear. He didn't glance. He studied every scratch, every replacement part. This wasn't someone who merely needed a bike, but someone who understood them. The other Javi stood slightly behind, arms crossed tightly, posture tense, as if trying to hide something he didn't want anyone to see. Kyle launched into his well-rehearsed act. "That one's rare. Gets attention all the time. Price went up this morning, $7,200, no discounts. If you're serious, you better move fast." Luis frowned. "The ad said 38. I screenshotted it." "Outdated data. That price is gone," Kyle replied, his tone flipping from friendly to firm in just 2 sentences. Javi exhaled slowly through his nose as if swallowing a stone. "We have to try," he muttered, not to Kyle but to himself. "My kid's on chemo this Friday, sold the truck last week. This is all I've got left." The words fell like a breeze, but to Ethan, they tore through every layer of pretense. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't begging, it was the voice of someone who had gone beyond pain, now shielded only by a wall of silence. Kyle didn't flinch. "If that's out of your range, try the scooters," he said, turning away like a man who had just closed a failed deal. "Craigslist might be cheaper, as long as it's got 2 wheels and makes a noise, right?" Then came a wink. Ethan stood frozen, fury rising to his throat, but he kept control. This wasn't just a bad transaction. It was a betrayal blatant and brutal of every principle his father had laid into the foundation of this place. The way Kyle measured human worth by their wallet. The way he looked at Luis and Javi not as customers, but as inconveniences to be ushered out quickly. Ethan found himself standing between 2 eras on one side, the false gleam of metrics and polish. On the other, the quiet dignity of men who once believed in row ride as a path to survival. Luis said nothing more. Javi turned away, eyes down. But Ethan had heard enough. He didn't step forward, not yet, not from fear or hesitation, but because he knew a hammer only strikes true when it's swung at the right time, in the right direction. And he needed to see more, to know whether this was just a surface crack or if the entire foundation had quietly crumbled over time. But within him, something had already begun to ignite, quiet and steady, like the first turn of an engine after a long, cold winter. The two men turned to leave, neither saying another word, but their shoulders told more than any complaint ever could. Ethan watched every step, recognizing in each movement the effort not to collapse under the weight of a place that once promised refuge for those who lived for engines and freedom. And just when he thought the moment had bottomed out, Kyle spoke again, this time like a man trying to land one final blow, not out of necessity, but to satisfy his own sense of triumph. "That bike'll be gone by the end of the day. Shame if you missed the deal just 'cause you thought you could haggle." The words carried a tone wrapped in business pragmatism, but Ethan knew better. It was the voice of a system that no longer placed people at the center, only numbers and margins. Luis, just steps from the door, stopped. He didn't turn, but his next sentence cut through the air like a blade. "This place used to be decent. Old Man Rowe would never run it like this." For Ethan, it wasn't just a judgment, it was a reckoning. The voice of someone who knew what honor once meant, now watching it be trampled by those who believed legacy was just a logo and not trust held firm when no one was forcing you to. Kyle laughed, clueless he had just stepped on something sacred. "Rowe's dead," he said, louder now, enough to pause the entire showroom. "Now the kid runs it, and he only cares about profit. No one's got time to babysit memories." Ethan froze. The words weren't just an insult to the memory of a father he had loved, struggled with, and admired. They were a slap to the man standing right there, a man seen as nothing more than a shadow. But Kyle kept going. "You think this is a charity? We sell bikes here, not dreams. If you're looking for hope, go buy a poster." In that moment, Ethan felt a particular kind of silence, one not born of quiet, but of rage pressed too deep, now hitting bottom. His throat went dry. His breath caught. All the things that used to soften him, the loyalty of longtime customers, the quiet thanks from those his father had once fixed bikes for free, were now twisted, insulted, sold off for the price of a smirk. Ethan stepped forward, slow but steady. He pulled off his sunglasses and slipped them into his pocket. No more disguise, no more role to play. His voice rang out, not loud but heavy, like a steel lock falling to a concrete floor. "You're fired." The room froze. Kyle turned, still half smiling, thinking it was a joke. "Come again?" He laughed nervously, scanning the room for confirmation. "You heard me," Ethan said, his words thick with control. "Pack your things and leave. Now!" Kyle blinked. A flicker of realization sparked in his eyes, and then recognition that the man he had just mocked wasn't just the founder's son, but the current CEO. "Mr. Rowe," he stammered. I didn't know." Ethan didn't let him finish. "Exactly. And that's the problem." His voice was cold and precise, like a torque wrench locking tight. Across the room, Luis and Javi stood frozen. Ethan turned to them, walking over, eyes meeting theirs, a blend of hesitation and fragile hope. "The bike's yours," he said to Javi. 3.8, no add-ons, no pressure, and if you need help getting it home, we'll take care of that." Javi could only stammer, I don't know what to say." Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder. "You came to buy a bike. That's all that matters." And when Kyle walked out the door, no one clapped, no one cheered. But something quiet returned, like the whole store had finally exhaled for the first time in years. That night, as the last lights in the showroom dimmed, Ethan sat alone in the old manager's office, the room his father once called the engine room of the soul. The buzz of the day had faded. No more engines revving, no more salesmen tapping at their keyboards. It was just him, the darkness, and a worn photograph he had just placed back on the desk. Robert Rowe, smiling gently, hands still stained with grease, standing beside a silver sports bike, with a younger man next to him, Marcus, the one who once said Ethan's father patched his tire for free and drove him to the hospital when his wife went into labor. The photo was faded, its corners curled with time, but because of that, it was real. Ethan lifted it with both hands, as if holding something alive. He was no longer a CEO, no longer the man emerging from boardrooms with slides crowded by data. In that moment, he was just a son, staring at the shadow of a father he had lost not to death, but to the silence that came from no longer listening to what the man once taught. He remembered long afternoons beneath the frame of a bike, his father talking about engines, though he was really teaching patience. He remembered the saying that had once become the pulse of the garage: "Wrench, not hammer we fix, we don't force." Ethan reached into a drawer and pulled out an old key, unlocking a steel cabinet no one had touched since the company moved all records to the cloud. Inside were handwritten invoices, blueprints of the first models, thank you notes from customers in ink, now faded and smudged items that had never made it into a quarterly report, but were once the very soul of Row Ride. One note in his father's own handwriting read, "A bike doesn't just carry people, it carries hope." Ethan read that line 3 times, each time feeling his heart pulled backward into an unnamed memory. He stood up and stepped out into the darkened showroom, now bathed in soft pink light from the sign out front. No engines were running, but every bike still seemed alive. He walked the rows like a man strolling through a graveyard of dreams, his hand grazing handlebars, seats, fairings, each scratch, each dent a story. He stopped at the space where the V-Star once sat, now gone, but the emptiness still carried a kind of gravity. This space had never been truly empty, it had only been missing one thing: memory. Back at the front counter, Ethan picked up a marker and erased the sales figures still scrawled across the whiteboard. Slowly, deliberately, he wrote 7 words: "The worth of a man is in his word." Then he stepped back, gazing at the phrase like it was a declaration not for the customers, but for himself. He wasn't promising to bring everything back to what it was, because nothing ever truly returns. But he knew that starting tomorrow, Row Ride would no longer be led from the top floor. It would be led from where oil once stained the floors, where engines once breathed from the ground. At dawn the next morning, desert sunlight cut across the large showroom windows, casting a space that felt both familiar and strangely new. But unlike the days before, today Ethan Rowe didn't arrive in his worn leather jacket or dusty boots. He wore the old Row Ride uniform shirt, with Jack stitched in red thread over the left chest, and a faint ink stain on the sleeve that had never quite washed out. It was the same shirt he wore at 18 as a shop hand working beside his father during that first summer when dreams gave way to sweat and engine noise. And today, it fit not just his body, but the purpose he carried. When Ethan stepped through the door, no one said a word. They just looked. With surprise, with curiosity, with skepticism. Kyle's desk sat empty. No explanation needed. His absence alone was enough to make everyone stand a little straighter, move with a little more care, and perhaps quietly, with a little more hope. Ethan shook hands with each person, calling them by names he once only knew from HR reports. No one refused. Eyes still wary, but no one turned away. And that was enough to begin. There was no meeting, no speech. The first change began with a ladder and a screwdriver. Ethan climbed to the signage above the service counter, where the sign once read, "Row Ride, power since 1983. He unscrewed each bolt carefully, removed the plaque, and replaced it with a matte black wooden board, white bold letters etched plainly, so stark it could never be commercialized. Where promises mean the journey. No applause followed, but one older mechanic murmured behind him, "It's finally back." Next came the pricing board. Ethan crossed out every extra charge, premium care packages, processing fees, mandatory add-ons, all gone, erased by his own hand, line by line, each word spoken aloud like a vow. Not today, not ever again. He restored the board to its truth: base prices, no fine print. No gimmicks. The new sales policy was issued with just one sentence sent to the managers. From now on, bonuses will be based not on how much a customer pays, but on how many stories they tell after leaving this store. A young technician asked quietly, "How do we measure that?" Ethan simply smiled. If a customer walks away and remembers the name of the person who helped them, that person did it right. That afternoon, Ethan made a call. It was for someone who, just days earlier, had nearly been dismissed from the premises with a condescending smile. "Javi." "I need someone who understands both machines and people," Ethan said. "Someone who knows what it means to stand on nothing but trust." And that was all it took. Javi accepted without hesitation. Marcus returned too, but not to buy a bike. Ethan appointed him as Keeper of the Word, a title never seen on payrolls, but one that bore more weight than any manager. To listen to customers, speak with each person who entered and exited the shop, and ensure no one was ever seen as a walking wallet again. That weekend, Row Ride wasn't perfect. The waiting area carried a hint of burnt coffee. One test bike didn't start on the first try. But the showroom had come back to life. Stories began to return not from digital displays, but from human voices. A father teaching his son to balance on the seat. A young woman buying her first helmet, asking about every single millimeter of head circumference. And Ethan, holding a water bottle, stood beside the service counter, wiping an oil smudge near the exit just as his father used to every evening. 2 weeks had passed since the day Ethan took off his sunglasses, removed his mask, and silenced the entire shop with just 2 words: "You're fired." In the rhythm of running a large business, 2 weeks might mean nothing, but in the life of a man reclaiming the soul of an organization, it was enough time for everything to begin to shift. Not through pressure, but through presence. Not by command, but by listening. On Saturday morning, sunlight still slanted through Row Ride's awning, as it always did. But today, Ethan wasn't standing in the upstairs office. He leaned against the wide-open frame of the maintenance bay door, a cheap gas station coffee in hand, a faint smile playing on his lips as he watched Javi, now the lead technician, teach a young mechanic how to hear the subtle sound of a transmission. Sweat already traced down his forearm, the kind of sweat only those who truly worked on bikes understand. Nearby, Marcus sat at the counter, talking calmly with a young couple about their first bike choice. His voice was steady, sincere, no tricks, just understanding. Ethan didn't interrupt. He just observed, and for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't running a business, but stewarding a community. A boy, about 10 years old, ran around the showroom, hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie, eyes sparkling as if the bikes were living creatures breathing beside him. He stopped before a worn red cruiser, looking up at his father, the tired man beside him, pride still shining through, and whispered, "That one's probably ridden far, huh?" Ethan stepped closer, crouched beside him, and smiled to start a conversation. "You like it?" The boy nodded. "Looks like it could tell stories." Ethan paused, then answered slowly, "Good bikes sometimes, remember." The child grinned and ran back to his father. Ethan stayed there a while longer, hand resting on the seat, not as a CEO, not as a son burdened by expectation, but simply as a man listening to the echoes of metal, dust, and memory. On the wall, his father's old photo, Robert Rowe, was freshly framed, yet still bore the cracked corner and a broken glass pane. Ethan left it that way intentionally. It was real, just like the way his father lived. Below the photo hung a small wooden plaque engraved with his father's words. "A man's worth lies in his word." No slogans, no branding, just a promise. Customers began to notice. A middle-aged man paused, staring long, then whispered, "He fixed my tire on July 4th, took no money, said no one should be stranded on a holiday." Stories like that began returning, not prompted, not recorded, but simply told. Because when people are heard, they tell. And when they tell, the truth comes back not in numbers, but in moments. Ethan started keeping a notebook under the counter, calling it the journey log. Any customer could write in it where they'd been, where they were headed, or who they thought of while sitting behind the handlebars. At first, it was just a fun idea. But in less than 2 weeks, the book was nearly full. Because what people really sought wasn't just a bike, it was remembrance. One Thursday afternoon, rain fell lightly over the workshop awning, as if even the weather softened to listen. A middle-aged man, leaning on a cane, entered the showroom, clutching a worn helmet with frayed edges, his eyes heavy with sorrow, carrying a past in every step. He didn't come to buy a bike. Quietly, he pushed an old motorcycle, a scratched black shadow, into the center of the display area, then stepped back, eyes never leaving it. Ethan recognized him. A longtime customer now battling a serious illness. The bike no longer ran. But it was a memory, the last thing he held from years of riding the roads with his late wife. "I can't ride it anymore," the man said, voice thick with emotion. "But I want my son to see it for what it really is before I'm gone." No cameras, no reporters, no social media posts, just Ethan standing there nodding. That night, he personally polished every detail of the shadow. Not for show, not for sale, just so that someone a son could remember his father not through a will, but through the worn grips and the scratched seat of a journey long past. And from that moment, Ethan knew. This journey was never just about selling bikes. It was about helping people keep going, keep living, keep remembering, keep believing. Every week, he spent time reading the journey log. Some wrote of their first ride taking their child to school down a dirt road. Others wrote of lost husbands and how the engine's hum still echoed in their dreams. There were short, heartbreaking lines. "I ride to forget cancer," or "Because today I still can." Beneath the corporate facade, Row Ride slowly returned to being a gathering place not just for bikes, but for people. Javi began offering free training to local teens on weekends. Marcus organized safety talks that always ended with tea and cookies baked by his wife. Once Ethan saw Rye, the man who once cried for not affording a bike paying for a woman's repair after her divorce, leaving no name. No one ordered these acts. No rules dictated them. Yet they became the culture. Ethan began rewriting the company's handbook, but not starting with operations or KPIs. The first page bore a single sentence: "We are here to help others keep going." Everyone who read it understood. This was no longer a company. This was a mission. That morning, Ethan stood at the entrance of Row Ride, sunlight streaming through worn brick grooves, holding a cheap plastic coffee cup from a familiar gas station. No ribbon cutting, no cameras, just a gentle breeze and laughter from behind, where Rye wiped his hands on an oily rag and Marcus chatted with a young woman picking her first bike. On the wall, a new black sign with white letters quietly reflected the dawn light, "Where promises mean the journey." The shy boy of about 10 stepped inside, followed by his tired but bright-eyed father. The boy paused before an old cruiser, hand resting on the gas tank. Ethan approached gently, asking, "You like it?" The boy nodded. "I think it's been ridden far." Ethan smiled softly. "Yeah, and if you listen closely, you'll hear, 'Sometimes bikes remember.'" The boy looked up. "Do they remember the riders?" Ethan nodded. "Good bikes do. They remember even the unfinished dreams." Those words weren't flowery phrases. Ethan had seen it in the eyes of the old man saying goodbye to his worn bike, in the scrawled lines of the journey log, in Rye's trembling hands as he first returned to the shop, this time as a trusted man. Bikes don't just carry people, they carry memories. And Row Ride, more than a brand, is where those memories are preserved, continued, and passed on. On the main desk, the old photo of Robert Rowe now rested in a simple wooden frame, glass unbroken. The cracked corner remained, a reminder that true legacy needn't be perfect, only honest. Below it hung a small plaque. "A man's worth lies in his word," not a slogan, but a compass. Ethan was no longer the CEO behind a boardroom desk. He was back to oiling bikes, guiding test rides, greeting each person crossing the threshold, And every day he felt another piece of memory return, not just his own, but that of everyone who once believed in a place where words still carried weight and a handshake still meant trust. By the end of the month, the journey log was nearly full. Ethan didn't print a new book right away. He sat reading each line in silence. One entry read simply, "I'm back." Another spanned 2 pages, telling of a father and his final ride with his son. But every story shared one truth: they needed to be heard. Ethan understood that the journey of renewal never truly ends. There would still be mistakes, still moments to fix both machines and people. But one thing was clear: the legacy he thought lost was not in reports, but in the laughter, tears, and grease-stained hands of those continuing on. It wasn't rebuilding, it was rebirth. And for the first time in many years, Ethan Rowe didn't see himself leading a business. He saw himself guarding a flame, a promise, a journey, not starting from the name on a chest patch, but from trust, the rarest metal forged by a father's hands. In a world where everything can be measured by metrics, profits, and performance, we often forget that the most lasting value of an organization isn't found in balance sheets, but in memories, in trust, and in how a leader treats the most vulnerable when no one is watching. Ethan Rowe didn't just rebuild a brand, he awakened its soul, with the very hands that once let go of the wrench, and a heart still believing in a truth that may seem old. A promise, when kept, can change the course of someone's journey. If you believe that a true business begins with people, and that sometimes we must return to the beginning to understand what we've lost, then hit like to spread this message. Don't forget to subscribe to stay connected with stories that dive deep, where compassion and integrity are not just ideals, but actions. And before you go, leave a comment with 3 words: keep the promise, so we know you too believe that true legacy starts with the simplest things.